3 years ago, and every once in a while you sort of feel the presence, but I don't know whether that's just because you want.
He once flew a plane through a hail of gunfire in his own war movie. He climbed the north face of a mountain where a crew member had just died and did it himself rather than send in a stunt double. He turned down James Bond. He turned down Superman. And right now, in a quiet town on the California coast, a man who has outlived 3 of his own leading ladies, buried a girlfriend 2 summers ago, and buried a business partner decades before that, still wakes up most mornings and goes to work like the sun owes him something. Clint Eastwood is 96 years old. His son says he is finally retired. Nobody who has followed this man's life for the last 70 years quite believes that's the end of the story, and by the time you hear how he actually got here, you probably won't either. Nobody looking at Clint Eastwood in 1930 would have guessed any of this. He was born on the 31st of May that year in San Francisco, and by every account he arrived enormous. So much so that the nurses in the delivery room nicknamed him after the strongest man in the Bible. His family wasn't scraping by. His father worked steadily even as the Great Depression tore through the rest of the country, and the Eastwoods lived comfortably in Piedmont, one of the nicer pockets of the East Bay, with the kind of stability plenty of families around them had lost. That detail matters because the rugged, self-made, hard-luck image Eastwood would later build his entire career on wasn't really where he started. It was something he constructed piece by piece once he understood what Hollywood wanted to sell. School never came easily to him. He struggled enough in junior high that he had to repeat a grade, and by the time he reached Oakland Technical High School, teachers noticed he had a presence, especially when he was made to get up in front of a room. But Clint wasn't interested in being noticed that way yet. He was more interested in cars and girls and anything with an engine in it, and some of the people who knew him back then genuinely aren't sure he ever finished with a diploma in hand. The one thing that hinted at a different kind of discipline living inside him was the piano. He taught himself to play seriously, practicing pieces most teenagers wouldn't have bothered attempting, and that same stubborn focus would resurface decades later when he started quietly composing music for his own films. After high school, there was no clear plan and no fast track in acting. He worked a string of jobs that had nothing to do with Hollywood, including a stretch cutting timber in the Pacific Northwest, work that was physically brutal and genuinely dangerous. Then came the Army, where he was stationed at Fort Ord in California and picked up extra money as a lifeguard, among other things. The story that tends to define this stretch of his life is a 1951 flight in a Navy aircraft that went down off the coast near Point Reyes. Eastwood survived the crash and had to swim a long distance through cold, rough water to reach shore. It's the kind of story that sounds embellished in hindsight, the near-death experience that conveniently sets up a legend, except it's well documented, and Eastwood has talked about it many times over the years as one of the most frightening nights of his life. His first real brush with the film industry was nowhere near glamorous. In the mid-1950s, he picked up a small part in a low-budget monster movie, playing a nervous lab technician in a handful of scenes. It wasn't a role that suggested stardom was coming. Not long after, Universal Studios let him go, deciding he simply didn't have what it took to be a leading man. The reasons given at the time were almost comically shallow, criticisms about the shape of his jaw and the pace of his speech, the kind of thing that sounds absurd only once you know how the story ends. For a while, Eastwood was just another young actor who'd been cut loose, doing the rounds, picking up whatever work he could find, wondering if the whole thing was going to happen for him at all. The break, when it came, was almost accidental. Eastwood was on a studio lot in Los Angeles, not even there for an audition, when a television executive happened to notice him and thought he had the right look for something the network was developing. That chance encounter led to a screen test, and the screen test led to a leading role in a new Western series called Rawhide. The show turned him into a familiar face across American living rooms for the better part of a decade, grinding through long days on set in brutal heat, 6 days a week, for years on end. Eastwood didn't even love the character he was playing, and by the time the show was winding down, he was restless, ready for something that would let him do more than deliver lines on a weekly schedule. That restlessness led him to Europe, and to one of the strangest gambles of his career. An Italian director nobody in America had heard of was making a Western on a tiny budget in Spain, and Eastwood, mostly because he figured almost no one back home would ever see it if it flopped, agreed to star. The director was Sergio Leone. The film was a fistful of dollars, and it changed everything. Eastwood built the now iconic look of his character almost entirely himself, piecing together a poncho, a hat, a cigar, and a worn set of boots and belts, and deciding that the character would say as little as possible and let his presence do the talking. American critics were brutal about the film and its two sequels when they eventually crossed the Atlantic, dismissing them as cheap and dismissing Eastwood's acting along with them. Audiences disagreed completely, and the trilogy became a global phenomenon, turning a television cowboy into an international movie star almost overnight. By the early 1970s, Eastwood had a shot at a role that had already been passed around Hollywood's biggest names. A gritty, morally complicated cop thriller had been offered to Frank Sinatra, who worked on it for a while before dropping out. Then Paul Newman, who wasn't comfortable with the politics of the material, but liked Eastwood for it and personally pointed the studio in his direction. Several other major stars of the era turned it down too, for their own reasons. Eastwood said yes, brought in his own production company to help shepherd it, and Dirty Harry became one of the defining hits of his career, along with one of the most quoted lines in movie history. What's easy to forget now is how many strange creative left turns Eastwood took right when he seemed to have his image locked in. In the late 1970s, at the height of his tough guy period, he starred in a broad comedy about a bare-knuckle brawler who travels around with a pet orangutan. Critics thought it was a career misstep. Audiences turned it into one of the biggest hits of his career and helped fund a sequel that did almost as well. Around the same period, while filming a thriller build around mountain climbing, a member of the crew was killed during production, and Eastwood, who was directing as well as starring, chose to perform many of the dangerous climbing sequences himself, rather than pull back from the material. He was in his mid-40s at the time, doing his own stunt work on a mountain that had already claimed a life during the shoot. Behind the camera is really where the second half of Eastwood's career gets interesting. By 1971, he was done waiting for other directors to shape his projects the way he wanted, so he directed his first film himself, a tense thriller shot largely in his hometown on the California coast, using real local locations instead of expensive studio sets. He finished it early and under budget, and it launched a directing career that would eventually produce 4 decades of work. Not long before that, tired of how rigid the traditional studio system could be, he and a small circle of advisors had formed his own production company, giving him far more control over what got made and how. His method on set became something actors either loved or found terrifying, depending on how they were built. Eastwood built a reputation for shooting scenes in 1 or 2 takes. No theatrics, no yelling, just quiet, controlled efficiency. He trusted that the first honest take from an actor was usually the truest one, and he expected people to show up ready, because there often wasn't a second chance waiting for them. That approach helped guide performers towards some of the most acclaimed work of their careers, and it became one of the most recognizable parts of his identity as a filmmaker, a director who somehow got enormous performances out of people by saying almost nothing at all. It's that directing career, more than anything else, that turned Eastwood from a respected action star into one of the most awarded filmmakers in American history. In his early 60s, he finally made a Western he had been sitting on for years, waiting until he felt old enough and worn enough to play the lead role honestly. That film swept the major awards and is widely considered one of the best Westerns ever made. Roughly a decade after that, he took on a boxing drama dealing with an intensely difficult subject that had studios nervous from the start. It became one of the most decorated films of his career and cemented him as a director who could handle heavy material without losing an audience. In between, he made a quiet, devastating drama about childhood trauma and its long shadow that earned some of his actors the best reviews of their careers. Then, well into his 70s, he made a film about a bitter, isolated war veteran slowly softening toward the immigrant family next door. It became one of the biggest box office hits of his entire filmmaking life, at an age when most directors have long since stopped working. The private side of Eastwood's life has always been more complicated than the calm, controlled image he projects on screen. He has 8 known children by 6 different women, and his personal relationships have rarely followed a simple or conventional shape. One of the more remarkable chapters surfaced publicly only in 2018, when a woman named Lori Murray, who had been adopted as an infant and raised by a family in the Seattle area with no knowledge of her biological father's identity, went searching for her birth parents as an adult and discovered that her father was Clint Eastwood himself. Eastwood hadn't known she existed either. Once the connection was confirmed, he welcomed her into the family, and she eventually appeared publicly alongside his other children at a film premiere more than 60 years after she was born. It's a genuinely unusual story: adoption, secrecy, and a decades-late reunion between a Hollywood icon and a daughter he never knew he had, and by all accounts it turned into a warm relationship rather than a bitter one. Other relationships in his life were far messier and played out much more publicly. His long partnership with actress and director Sandra Locke ended in a bitter and highly public legal battle in the late 1980s, one that dragged through the courts for years and became one of the more talked-about Hollywood breakups of its era. In his later years, Eastwood found something steadier and considerably quieter with Christina Sandera, a woman he met while she was working at a hotel he owned in Carmel by the Sea. She largely avoided the spotlight throughout their relationship, staying out of interviews and public appearances, and by the accounts of people close to the family, she was well-liked and fully accepted by Eastwood's children. She died in the summer of 2024 at the age of 61, and Eastwood's own public statement about her loss was brief, describing her simply as a lovely, caring woman he would miss deeply. His daughter Morgan later wrote publicly about what a devastating loss it was for the whole family. Fatherhood itself seems to have changed in tone as Eastwood aged. By his own admission, he spent long stretches of his younger years working constantly, all over the world, and wasn't always as present as he might have liked to be for his older children. He said openly that he became a considerably more attentive father the second and third time around, showing up at school events and softball games for his younger daughters, even when, in his own words, he looked a little ridiculous standing on the sidelines next to parents decades younger than him. Multiple people close to the family, including his children, have described him as unexpectedly warm and playful as a grandfather, a noticeably softer version of the man audiences spent decades watching squint his way through violent, unforgiving westerns and crime thrillers. For a long time, the assumption inside and outside Hollywood was that Eastwood simply wasn't going to stop working, full stop, regardless of age. That assumption held up for an extraordinarily long time. In 2024, in his mid-90s, he directed and released a courtroom thriller about a juror who slowly realizes he may have accidentally caused the very crime the trial is centered on. It was shot with the same lean, no-frills efficiency that has defined his directing style for 50 years, and critics generally responded to it as a genuinely strong piece of filmmaking, not a sentimental victory lap handed to an aging legend out of respect. For a while afterward, rumors persisted that he was quietly developing yet another project, and some reports even suggested he'd been spotted around the Warner Brothers lot working on something new. But more recently, his son Kyle has said plainly, in interviews discussing his own career, that his father has retired, closing the book on one of the longest and most productive directing careers in American film history at 96 years old. Whether that really is the final word remains genuinely uncertain, because very little about Clint Eastwood's career has followed the pattern anyone expected. He was told he didn't have what it takes at 25 and became one of the biggest stars in the world within a decade. He was mocked for making a comedy with an orangutan, and it became one of his biggest hits ever. He was pushing 80 when he made one of the most successful films of his career, and pushing 94 when he made a courtroom drama that critics genuinely respected rather than politely tolerated. If there's a through line across all of it, it isn't toughness for its own sake, and it isn't luck, even though luck clearly played its part more than once. It's a kind of stubbornness about doing things his own way, on his own schedule, whether that meant flying to Spain for a nobody director's cheap western, or performing his own mountain climbing stunts in his 40s, or quietly building a relationship with a daughter he met for the first time when he was already in his 80s. His daughter Allison has said the biggest lesson she ever took from him was simple: don't take life too seriously. For a man who has spent 7 decades being one of the most serious, most intimidating faces in American film. That might be the most surprising thing about him of all.